Welcome to the podcast, everyone. Today, we're diving into a fascinating and crucial topic: nuclear disarmament and confidence building in the Korean Peninsula. We'll be discussing a recent SIPRI Insights paper that offers some compelling ideas on the path forward.
Hi, Andrew, and hello to our listeners. I'm Mark, and I'll be guiding us through this discussion. The paper we're focusing on today is from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI, a highly respected source of research on conflict and disarmament. It was written by Titi Aresto, a senior researcher in the SIPRI Weapons of Mass Destruction program.
So, Mark, what's the core argument of this paper?
Essentially, the paper explores the possibilities for building confidence in the Korean Peninsula. It addresses the conflict dynamics that underlie the excessive militarization in that region. It argues that a key reason for the failure of past diplomatic efforts has been the coercive approach in pursuit of immediate nuclear disarmament in North Korea. Instead, the author suggests a more incremental approach, focusing on confidence-building measures to reduce instability and address the security concerns that drive North Korea's nuclear policy.
Mark, you mentioned the failures of past diplomatic efforts. Can you elaborate on what specifically went wrong with previous attempts at denuclearization?
Absolutely, Andrew. A central argument in the SIPRI Insights paper is that previous diplomatic endeavors, particularly those led by the US, have faltered due to a primarily coercive approach. These efforts heavily emphasized demanding complete, verifiable, and irreversible disarmament from North Korea right off the bat.
So the big stick approach.
Precisely. There was an over-reliance on sanctions and pressure tactics, with the idea that these measures would force North Korea to abandon its nuclear weapons program. However, this strategy didn't pay sufficient attention to North Korea's underlying security concerns and the need for confidence-building measures.
So less carrot and more stick.
Exactly. It didn't incentivize North Korea to come to the table and lacked a focus on creating an environment of trust and mutual understanding. Furthermore, previous efforts didn't adequately reward incremental progress with sanctions relief. North Korea made some gestures towards nuclear restraint, but the international community was slow to reciprocate with tangible benefits, leading to a breakdown in trust and ultimately a collapse in diplomacy. The paper argues that a more balanced approach, one that combines pressure with incentives and prioritizes confidence building, is essential for achieving sustainable progress towards nuclear disarmament.
So, Mark, given these shortcomings, what does the paper identify as the key drivers of instability in the Korean Peninsula right now?
Well, Andrew, the paper highlights two major factors contributing to the heightened instability: preemptive military doctrines and the erosion of confidence-building measures, or CBMs, between North and South Korea.
Can you break those down a bit? What are these preemptive military doctrines?
Sure. Both South Korea and the US have in recent years leaned towards military strategies that emphasize preemption. South Korea, for instance, has its kill chain strategy, which is designed to proactively destroy North Korean nuclear and missile assets if there are clear indications of an imminent attack. The US has also hinted at similar options, including the potential use of nuclear weapons to target North Korea's hardened facilities.
So it's a case of we'll strike before you can. How does this fuel instability?
Exactly. And that creates a very dangerous use it or lose it scenario. If North Korea perceives an imminent threat of a disarming or decapitating strike, it might feel compelled to launch a preemptive nuclear attack to avoid total destruction. This creates a very tense and unstable situation where the risk of miscalculation and accidental war is significantly increased.
And you mentioned the erosion of confidence-building measures as another key driver of instability.
Yes, in the past, North and South Korea had various mechanisms in place to prevent and manage military incidents along their shared border. These included things like military hotlines, no-fly zones, and restrictions on artillery drills. Unfortunately, many of these measures have been abandoned in recent years, leading to increased tensions and a greater risk of low-level incidents escalating into something far more serious.
So, Mark, what does the paper propose as a way forward? What kind of framework could lead to a more stable situation?
The paper advocates for a comprehensive framework of cooperative risk reduction and regional arms control. This approach moves beyond simply trying to eliminate North Korea's nuclear weapons and instead focuses on addressing the underlying threat perceptions of all key parties and creating a more stable and peaceful environment in the Korean Peninsula.
What are the key elements of this framework?
There are several important components. First, it requires nuclear restraint by North Korea, including a freeze on its nuclear program and missile testing. Second, there needs to be sanctions relief from the UN to incentivize North Korea to take these steps and demonstrate good faith. Crucially, the paper emphasizes the importance of strategic and military confidence-building measures, or CBMs, to reduce tensions and build trust. Finally, the framework calls for broader regional involvement to support the process and provide security guarantees.
You mentioned nuclear restraint by North Korea. Realistically, what does that look like?
A tangible starting point would be a verifiable freeze of North Korea's nuclear program and a moratorium on testing nuclear weapons and long-range missiles. This would need to include the closure and monitoring of their fissile material production facilities at Yongbyon.
Sanctions relief is also important, you said, but there's a lot of political resistance to that.
Absolutely, it would likely be incremental. The paper suggests initially focusing on UN Security Council sanctions that are negatively impacting the humanitarian situation in North Korea, those sanctions which don't have a direct impact on their nuclear program. If North Korea implements the first stage of nuclear arms control, halting production of fissile material and tritium at Yongbyon, that could be met by a suspension of those damaging sanctions.
What about countries beyond North Korea and the US? What role do they play?
The framework envisions broader regional involvement to support the process. Other countries could help reinforce security guarantees and foster an environment of cooperation and dialogue. It's about building a sense of shared responsibility for maintaining peace and stability in the region.
You mentioned strategic CBMs. What form could these measures take?
Strategic CBMs are all about signaling restraint and reducing the risk of miscalculation. South Korea and the USA could signal restraint by scaling back any preemptive military options, those doctrines we talked about that increase instability. Revising national security strategies to renounce those preemptive strikes would be key. It's also important to avoid actions that could be perceived as threatening, like strategic bomber overflights near the Korean Peninsula.
And who guarantees that everybody keeps their word?
Great question. Bringing in other regional powers to cooperatively provide security guarantees to North Korea could be incredibly important. Getting other countries involved demonstrates a shared commitment to stability and could boost the credibility of those guarantees.
What about more direct military measures?
Right. We need to revive inter-Korean military CBMs. Strengthening those measures is critical for preventing military incidents and promoting stability.
Is that even possible at this point?
It's tough. Experience shows it's difficult to sustain inter-Korean dialogue without the US also engaged on the nuclear issue. Those two tracks really need to be aligned, and we should start thinking about conventional arms control to reduce overall military buildup around the peninsula.
And on the non-military side of things?
Suspension of those UN Security Council sanctions I mentioned earlier could unlock opportunities for economic and cultural exchanges. But these have to be mutually beneficial and cooperative. Any joint project should be based on cooperation between equals instead of one country simply preparing for reunification.
So, Mark, to summarise, we've discussed the need for a shift in approach. We need cooperative risk reduction, the deployment of strategic and military CBMs, and a phased approach to nuclear diplomacy that recognises incremental progress.
Exactly. It's about building trust and creating a sustainable path towards stability, rather than demanding immediate, unrealistic outcomes.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mark, for sharing your expertise on this crucial topic.
My pleasure, Andrew.
For our listeners who want to dive deeper into this topic, be sure to visit MissileNet's Intel Substack. There you can access the full SIPRI report we discussed today, along with a helpful report guide and summary, providing a more detailed overview of these complex issues. Thanks for listening.